How can I not?
This is New Day with Allison Camerata and John Berman.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to a special holiday edition of New Day. John Berman is off. John Avlon joins me. Happy President's Day.
Happy President's Day to you, my favorite holiday.
Oh, is it?
No, I'm just kidding. But I do love presidents.
And you are going to dress up as one later in the program.
There may be a
You've
top hat,
promised.
yes.
Fantastic. All right, a top White House official says President Trump is prepared to issue the first veto of his presidency if Congress tries to repeal his national emergency that circumvents Congress for border wall money. Democrats are planning to introduce a resolution soon disapproving of the emergency declaration, where it is expected to pass both chambers. If the president vetoes that resolution, will enough Republican lawmakers then go against the president to override his veto?
President Trump already facing legal challenges, something he acknowledged would happen. California's Attorney General says he's working with officials in several states to sue the White House. We're expecting to see protests across the country today in response to the president's emergency declaration. Plus, we have the latest bombshell revelations from fired FBI Deputy Director Andrew McCabe's new book.
Well, John, good morning. And the White House is digging in and preparing to defend the president's national emergency declaration as California and at least 6 other states prepare lawsuits. And the ACLU, among other groups, is also preparing for a legal battle with the Trump administration. But beyond these roadblocks in court, House Democrats are getting ready to pass that resolution of disapproval to try to stop the president from using his executive power in this way. That could gain some support in the Senate, where there are some Republicans who are uncomfortable with this use of executive authority. But top Trump advisor Stephen Miller said yesterday that the president may be willing to veto that measure if it reaches his desk. Take a listen.
Will the president veto that, which would be the first veto of his presidency?
Well, obviously, the president is going to protect his national emergency declaration, Chris. And I know that we're out of time, but again, I want to make this point. There's no threat.
So, yes, he will veto?
He's going to protect his national emergency declaration, guaranteed.
Now, around the country today, there are protests against the president's use of a national emergency being planned. Those protests come amid uncertainty about where exactly the administration will be getting the roughly $6 billion in federal funds that the president is hoping to unlock with this national emergency declaration. Acting Defense Secretary Pat Shanahan said over the weekend that he's going to start to review what programs at the Pentagon he'll cut. Keep in mind that much of this money, about half, will be coming from military construction funds, so
now, because those are things that people fought for, they voted for, those are things that constituents wanted, that they were expecting. And so, you know, you have to rob Peter to pay Paul, basically. Sarah, thank you very much. Let's bring in Jeffrey Toobin, CNN chief legal analyst, Bakari Sellers, former member of South Carolina's House of Representatives, and Alice Stewart. She was the communications director for Ted Cruz. And that's where I want to start, Alice, because explain to us how people like your former boss, Ted Cruz, can get on board with this. You know, Senator Cruz has called it a slippery slope, that he's a little concerned with the fact that the president's doing an end run around Congress. But ultimately, will Senator Cruz get on board with the fact that he's handing over the power of the purse to the president?
What we're going to see, in my expectation, Allison, is many Republicans here in Washington will get on board with this, because this president ran and won on building a wall and securing the border, and many of them also included that in part of what they ran and won on. So this is an important issue. And now, with many things that this president has done, I agree 100% with the policy of it, but the pathway he has used to get there is something that I do have some concerns with.
But meaning what? You agree with the emergency declaration, or you don't?
I agree with his commitment to securing the border and keeping America safe. And building a wall is something that he has wanted to do from the very beginning, and he has been committed to that. Look, I agree declaring an emergency is going to cause some concerns down the road. We're certainly looking at the potential for facing legal challenges, but this is something that he was committed to doing and is following through on. The concern with doing this is the precedent that this sets. What is to stop a future Democrat president from declaring a national emergency on an issue that they think is important, whether it is climate change, whether it is gun control, whether it is abolishing ICE. So that is the concern. However, the president does have the authority to do so. I think it will ultimately be decided in court, but legally he has the authority to do so, and Congress gave him that back during the National Emergencies Act.
But Jeff, you know, one of the problems, of course, is that the president's undercut his own argument, knowing this legal challenge would come after floating this for weeks. Let's take a listen to how just he created a problem for himself, potentially.
I could do the wall over a longer period of time. I didn't need to do this, but I'd rather do it much faster.
I didn't need to do this. How does that justify a national emergency?
What the president was saying is that like past presidents, he could choose to ignore this crisis, choose to ignore this emergency, as others have, but that's not what he's going to do.
That's, of course, not exactly what he said. And the problem is that while emergency is not defined in this statute, the dictionary definition of emergency certainly doesn't fit this. And this weekend, he's at Mar-a-Lago at the Omelet Bar, also not exactly communicating urgency.
Nothing says rapid and fast like an omelet bar.
Yeah. So
they cook fast. I mean, right?
Well, presumably for the president. But, you know, nonetheless, did the president create a problem for himself where he was already going to face a serious challenge legally?
He did create a problem for himself, but I don't know if it's an insurmountable problem. I mean, remember, courts are very cognizant of their own institutional limitations. They know that they don't have the resources to do the kind of investigation that the executive branch has. And there will certainly be some judges, I don't know how many, and you know, this is a novel legal question, but there will certainly be some judges who say, look, it is the executive branch's decision how to define an emergency. They will certainly come with arguments that say this is an emergency. And some judges will say, we just are not going to second guess the executive branch in this area. Whether that's 5 Supreme Court justices, I don't know. My guess is it probably is. I think we are now in a moment, a conservative moment in our courts, where there is a lot of deference to the executive branch. So I think, you know, this is not a slam dunk for either side, this legal case. But if I had to guess, I would say the president is ultimately going to win.
Bakari, I was so struck by Stephen Miller's timeline that he gave this weekend. So he said that he was asked when he thinks that this wall, the barrier, will be built. Now, remember, it was supposed to be 55 miles in the bipartisan deal, but now it's 230, I guess. And he said September of 2020. September of 2020, for a national emergency, they can't build a barrier before 19 months from now? Because September of 2020 seems like people might be busy thinking about who they're going to vote for, and it might be convenient to unveil the wall then. It seemed like a political timeline.
Well, it is, and I think that Jeffrey actually has an amazing point, because I don't think this is as much of a constitutional issue for this White House as it is a political issue. I do think we're in a conservative moment, and I do think there will be a lot of deference to the executive branch in this matter. But the fact is, the president created for himself a political problem. The first is, not only is he trying to fulfill a campaign promise, but he's trying to fulfill a campaign promise and pull the wool over the people's eyes, because he said he was going to build a wall that Mexico was going to pay for. We all know that this is now going to come out of the pockets of American citizens. But even more importantly, the second point is, we know that this is going to come out of the pockets of our military men and women, because we see where this money is going to come from. The real emergency or crisis that we have is on our military bases, where they have a shortage of housing, and this money, or these monies, were going to go towards building that housing. The larger question that they have to answer politically is, if you have a House and Senate majority for 2 years, how is it an emergency now, but it was not an emergency then? I think that's one of the largest and most looming questions they have. I don't think they have a legal question. I think the courts will side with this White House, unfortunately. I think they have a real big political problem that they're trying to solve. And I don't think the American public is going to forget who's supposed to pay for this wall, because, to be honest, those of us, the 5 of us sitting on this show, aren't supposed to be paying for this wall. I thought Mexico was paying for it.
So, Alice, I mean, Bakari just said that it's possible, quite possible, that the courts may decide in the president's favor. Jeffrey concurs. So, as a concern, brought to bear by a Democratic president, will you and your fellow conservatives support the precedent, or will you fight it as political overreach?
Well, Don, based on our CNN poll, look at the numbers.
Let's do that.
Republicans, more than 60% of Republicans say they support the president's emergency declaration. More than around 74% of conservative Republicans support this idea of emergency declaration. So clearly he has the support of Republicans, and certainly what he has posted a lot of his emphasis on is the more conservative Republicans. That is what will help him continue to fight what he's doing.
Sure.
And let me just say to Bakari's point, yes, ideally, we would have built this wall and Mexico would have paid for it. When that didn't happen, the dynamics of how to achieve this certainly changed. But even with Republicans in control in the House and Senate, we still needed Democrat support. And when we put DACA on the table and we put protections for TPS recipients on the table, and we also put humanitarian aid on the table, and Democrats were still on the point of saying no, that right there shows that Democrats are not willing to secure the border. And that is something that all Americans can agree on. So it's time for everyone to come together. And since we did not get Democrat support on issues that they have wanted,
2 points just for clarity on that. First of all, the president offered basically a 3-year reprieve for Dreamers and DACA recipients, not what the Democrats were asking for, which was a path to citizenship. But I want to bear into those numbers a little bit, of course. I want to bear into those numbers. That would indicate that this is about politics, not principle. And if that's the standard we're going to use, can we expect conservatives to sing a very different tune about executive power when a Democratic president tries to pull an emergency order? Will you be fighting a Democratic president who tries to do a similar thing?
There's always going to be a situation where when President Obama uses executive powers and using his pen and phone with specifically regard to DACA, there were a lot of Republicans, myself included, that had some concern with his end run around Congress. But at the end of the day, he was president of the United States. He had the authority to make that decision. And at the end of the day, he chose to do so, and I supported that decision as president. I think when we all look back on this, we can recognize the fact the president does have the authority to do so, and he is the president of the United States. He campaigned and won on this issue. And as much as it's painful to say, Democrats have to accept that.
Can I just ask? I mean, we're talking about the procedure here and how many people want this wall at all? I mean, that's the thing that is so interesting to me, is that the president has bet his presidency on a project that is, again, popular with his base, but not with much of anyone else. And I mean, look, as I often point out, I was wrong about 2016. I'll probably be wrong about 2020. But I don't get why this is such a winning issue for him.
It goes further than that, in fact. But hold on, Bakari, because I want you to comment on this. The things that he's promising the wall can do are also really questionable. You know, he promised that he was going to tackle the opioid crisis. Opioid overdoses have gone up under President Trump. He's now claiming in that press conference that the wall will solve the drugs, the heroin and fentanyl and opioids coming into this country. Really? What's going to happen when you seal off those 230 miles and somehow, miraculously, we still have an opioid crisis in this country?
Well, I mean, the word of the day should be hypocrisy. I mean, I understand Alice's point. She wasn't quite accurate on the TPS and DACA because the president actually took those away and then tried to give it back in negotiations. But hypocrisy is the word of the day. I mean, that the presidential overreach, when you talk about DACA and how you should not use your emergency powers to do such things as this, and it was a slippery slope and it was unconstitutional, but to now stand back and allow this to happen. In January of 2021, if there is, and we hope there to be, a Democratic president, and on day one, they declare a national emergency on gun violence in this country, which is running rampant. On day one, if they declare a national emergency on climate change, which is destroying this earth that we've inherited, then I think Republicans are going to all out have a hissy fit. And the problem that we're seeing is that no one right now is having any conviction. There's not one Republican who stands on the side of the Constitution. That's the biggest problem.
All right, Bakari, Jeffrey, Alice, thank you very much for all of your varied perspectives on this.
Thanks, Allison.
Okay, he's the first Republican to say that he wants to challenge President Trump in 2020. Up next, we talk to former Massachusetts Governor William Weld on if he thinks he has a chance and why now.
This is CNN Breaking News.
I have established an exploratory committee to pursue the possibility of my running for the presidency of the United States. As a Republican, we cannot sit passively as our precious democracy slips quietly into darkness.
All right, that is former Massachusetts Governor Bill Weld announcing an exploratory committee to challenge President Trump for the Republican nomination in 2020. In his speech, Governor Weld said Republicans in Washington exhibit all the symptoms of Stockholm syndrome, and he is doing his part to stand up to the schoolyard bully, end quote. Joining us now is former
time, because the New Hampshire primary is 1 year away. Time's a wasting if one's going to make a serious effort to have the actual issues discussed, as opposed to a bunch of political palaver and slogans and infighting in Washington. Now's the time to do it.
But was there something that President Trump did that made you think, yes, I'm going to get in? I mean, when you say that he's too unstable to carry out the duties of higher office, what was it? How so?
You know, one moment does stick in my mind, and that's the time when the president shooed all the U.S. press out of the Oval Office and Oregon. That showed contempt for the American people, if anything I've ever seen does.
He shared classified information during that.
Yeah, no, it just gets worse and worse. And the president does not exhibit curiosity about history or even world events. It troubles me that he abroad, he seeks out the company of people who are dictators and despots, people like Vladimir Putin, like President Kim of North Korea. He said of President Kim, oh, what a great, strong kid. He iced his uncle. He even iced his own brother. I mean, this is mob talk, with which I had some familiarity from my days in the Justice Department.
And so was that the moment when you saw what he did in the Oval Office with sharing classified information, was that the moment where you thought, I think I'm going to primary, I'm going to try to launch a primary attack on him?
There was not one moment. I do think the president has shown a tendency to associate with autocrats. I think his domestic instincts are in the same direction. I recall him saying on television, wouldn't it be great if we didn't have to have elections? I'm sure he will say that was a joke. I'm not so sure it was a joke. I mean, the response to my announcement of an exploratory committee has been for everybody to close ranks among the state Republican parties and say, no, we can't have a primary. And the truth is, if the president had his first choice, he wouldn't have a primary and he wouldn't have an election.
So when you say that some of your fellow Republicans have Stockholm syndrome, who are you referring to?
Oh, the general reception in Congress is pretty quiet to some of the president's outrageous conduct and behavior. And by that, I mean they identify with their captor. That's what Stockholm syndrome means. So they identify with him as the emblem of the Republican Party. You couldn't have a much worse emblem in my view. So it's just everybody going quiet. There's a hush over the Republican Party in Washington, D.C., and they're content to let the president take the lead and be the spear point, and he's going in all the wrong directions, in my view. This whole thing about the wall is a political symbol for him. All the experts would tell you what we really need down there near the border is more drones, more people. And I realize the president campaigned on it, but it doesn't make it any more attractive an issue. It goes right back to the nativism of the Know-Nothing Party in the 1850s, which was half of the Whig Party. The other half became the Republican Party of Abraham Lincoln. And I'm trying to get us back in the Republican Party of Abraham Lincoln rather than the Know-Nothing anti-Catholic zealots of the 1850s.
I just don't know if that's where the Republican Party is right now. Here's the latest poll by CNN. This is in terms of whether people support the national emergency for a border wall. This is among conservative Republicans, which, of course, is the president's base. 72% say yes. 21% say no. And so when you say that, you know, Republicans are sort of in the sway of the president, I mean, aren't they in the sway of his base? And they don't want to alienate them.
Well, there is a very conservative group, probably not my base for sure. There are 20 primaries where independents, unenrolled voters can come in and vote in the Republican primary. Those will have my attention. But beyond that, in states like New Hampshire, people like to sit down and talk with the candidates and see them up close and personal. You know, I think when you have conversations with people, sort of that stranglehold of the two parties as they present, then I think there is a good chance that people can be reflective and think there's another way to do things than to waste all this time in Washington.
Well, last time around, I mean, you ran as part of a third-party ticket. What do you think of Howard Schultz's run as an independent?
I think people are giving Howard Schultz a bad rap, and they say, "Oh, he's going to hurt the Democrats because all his votes will come from the Democrats." I don't think so. Howard Schultz is a business guy. I think his votes would come from Trump. The Libertarian vote last time, when I was on the ticket with former Republican Governor Gary Johnson, our votes came 3-1 out of Trump, not from Mrs. Clinton. And the Democrats howled that we cost them the election. But think about it. A Libertarian vote is going to be a change vote or a protest vote. Those were not going to go to Mrs. Clinton last time.
So why don't you run as an independent?
I thought about the Libertarian Party again, but I decided I really wanted to go mano a mano with Mr. Trump. There are so many things he's doing that I think are undermining our democratic institutions, and I think he's leading the country in the most fundamental way in the wrong direction. And that clearest shot is in the Republican primary.
And so one of your strategies, as you just said, is to focus on the states where Democrats can vote in the Republican primary.
No. Democrats can't ever take a Republican ballot. It's unenrolled and independent voters who can come in, and that always helped me when I was running. The independents came in and voted for me 6-1 because they saw me as kind of a centrist, maybe center-right, but somebody who would work across the aisle to try to get things done. That's what's not happening in Washington, D.C. right now.
Well, Governor Bill Weld, thank you for explaining all of this to us. Obviously, we will be watching very closely your next moves.
Thanks, Allison.
All right, a programming note, Democratic presidential candidate Senator Amy Klobuchar will take part in a CNN town hall with Don Lemon tonight at 10 p.m. only on CNN. This is in New Hampshire.
And up next, his story got attention from Hollywood to presidential candidates. Now there's serious questions about whether Empire actor Jussie Smollett was attacked or if it was all a hoax. The latest twist in the case. Next.
Was it a hate crime or a hoax? Law enforcement sources tell CNN that Chicago police now believe that Empire actor Jussie Smollett paid two men to orchestrate an attack on him. Smollett's attorneys deny that the actor played any role in his own attack. So joining us now to talk about all of this is Charles Blow. He's an opinion columnist for the New York Times, and Brian Stelter. He's CNN's chief media correspondent. Great to have both of you here. Brian, I remember in the hours right after this happened that CNN, that our bosses were advising to pump the brakes a little bit because there were some things already that didn't add up. I was frankly surprised how many people jumped on board to side with Jussie Smollett before there were photos, before there were police statements, before all that stuff. And so how do you think this all, what was the trajectory of how this went wrong?
Yeah, the headline was so sensational and so disturbing. It first came out on TMZ, not only that Smollett said he'd been attacked, but that the attacker said, this is MAGA country. Well, obviously, Chicago at 2 in the morning is not MAGA country, so that didn't make sense in the first place. Lots of parts of this story didn't make sense. But activists, actors, Hollywood celebrities, friends of Smollett, Democratic presidential candidates, they all wanted to sound like they were doing the right thing, saying the right thing, standing up for a victim. There's an inherent tension in this story between wanting and needing to believe victims and yet knowing that people can take advantage of that, taking advantage of the idea that it's important to believe victims. And that tension has been in this story for weeks. There was a rush to judgment. I think it was mostly in the celebrity press and among activists and among Twitter people. I think it was a really careful reporting by news organizations. But it all gets lumped in together at the end of the day. It all gets lumped in together in the minds of many people who now look at this and say, what went wrong here? And obviously, at the end of the day, what went wrong is that he may have made it up. And ultimately, That's his responsibility.
Ultimately, that's right. But, Charles, I mean, it's understandable in a context to take a victim's word at first, but there does need to be due diligence. And I want to do two things here. One, I want to put this against the larger context of hate crimes in this country, because in 2017, I believe it is, over 7,000 hate crimes in the United States. That was up 17% compared to 2016. So it's important to keep that in mind as we confront the possibility that this was a hoax. And it's not the only hoax of this kind of nature we've seen. We saw the UVA reporting around what Rolling Stone did, stories out of the Air Force Academy, St. Olaf College. So this is not undiscovered territory, but it raised the question, against the backdrop of this being a real problem in the country, what's the psychology of a hate crime hoax? Why would somebody do that? Because it diminishes the real instances so much.
Well, I mean, right, I'm not a psychologist, so I'll take a stab at this, though. I mean, I think that if he did this, and people who do this, I mean, I think you do have to find a villain who your target audience would believe. And I think that in this case, if this is true, it was very believable that a gay man who could be gay bashing. If you take the celebrity out of this, and if you dig down into your hate crime numbers, it is even more stark among people who are queer in this country. They are more likely to be assaulted, both sexually and not sexually, and by everybody, including authorities. And they don't have the platform. Many of them are estranged from family. Many of them experience kind of housing insecurity and food insecurity. They just don't have the voice. And so the big concern for me is whether or not it impacts those genuine victims and their ability or their willingness to come forward and say something happened. Because very often in cases of assault, sexual and not, there are no witnesses. There is no evidence to preserve, and it is a question of character. And in this case, people were making a character judgment. Jussie is very close to the character he plays on television. He is a musician. He is gay. He has, in his personal life, he has been involved in some very worthy kind of community actions, including most recently trying to save a historically black women's college in the South, Bennett College. He does that sort of thing. So if people were making a gut-level decision about, is this a character who I believe, why would he? The question of motive is still murky.
Yeah, for sure. But I mean, also the fact that the surveillance cameras hadn't picked anything up, and that place was lined with surveillance cameras. I mean, there were some things that aroused suspicion.
Well, I think Brian made an important point about, like, the collision of healthy skepticism with the historical truth that people are not generally believed on assault.
And when it becomes cynicism, and when it becomes an excuse to ignore real crimes and real problems, then that's even worse. This is a mystery still, though. Why would he do this if he did? What is the motive? That remains a mystery, and the police say, we just need to talk to him.
He sat down with Robin Roberts, I don't remember if it was last week.
Yeah, last week.
Last week. And she pressed him on some of this. So watch this now.
Who the would make something like this up or add something to it or whatever it may be? I can't even, I'm an advocate. I'm pissed off.
What is it that has you so angry? Is it the attackers?
It's the attackers, but it's also the attacks. It feels like if I had said it was a Muslim or a Mexican or someone black, I feel like the doubters would have supported me a lot more. And that says a lot about the place that we are in our country right now.
It's more uncomfortable to watch it now, knowing all of the questions that the Chicago police have gone public with now.
Yeah, orchestrate this hoax. These two men who were in custody last week, they've cooperated, they've provided evidence to the police. So it's now in his court. And we do need to hear more of his side of the story. As of Saturday night, his lawyers were saying he's the victim of a hate crime, so he was not changing his tune.
No, that's important to note. But Charles, he also very quickly, even in that interview, is elevating it to an exemplar of a national conversation, saying this is about the ugliness of the national conversation, and I'm the victim of that. And that first performance back, I believe in West Hollywood, saying I'm going to come back from this. So by elevating it and making it a national metaphor, What is he trying to communicate? If it's all at the bottom of a hoax, not that you can get inside his head, but he's the one raising this to a national element, which elevating it to national conversation, which makes the possibility of it being a hoax that much more devastating.
Well, listen, if Jussie has done what the Chicago police say he has done, it's not just that he's an actor, Brian. This is an insane person. This is a psychopath. Like, and there's nothing in his history that suggests that he's a psychopath.
But why
So that is why it's so hard for everybody to, that's why people are waiting, trying to figure out, like, please go back and interview him, Chicago PD. But we need to understand what's the motive, because nothing, I met him one time. He was the sweetest, it was just in passing at Essence Fest, and I was with a girl with the college, she's a big fan, and she had to have a picture. He was the most gracious person, and I think that that's the kind of feeling that people have on him. So if you did this, we need to know, like, are you crazy? Like, did you literally, like, lose it? Or because nothing is adding up about why he would do this.
Well, one thing's for certain, this story is not over yet.
Brian, Charles, thank you both very much. All right, a potential breakthrough in relations between the U.S. and North Korea. We have some exclusive details for you next. As Michelle Kaczynski is live in Washington with more. What have you learned, Michelle?
Yeah, well, this has been a big question leading up to this summit. What exactly is going to come out of it? Because North Korea has really made no moves towards real denuclearization other than saying that it wanted to. And there's so little confidence out there that North Korea will denuclearize anytime soon. So where we are now is a stalemate. There's been lots of talking going on, especially since the last summit in Malaysia, but North Korea has been wanting the U.S. to make some kind of significant move before it did anything towards denuclearization. So now we're hearing from senior diplomatic sources that there are serious discussions going on to exchange diplomats between the two countries. This would be very, very preliminary, though. It wouldn't be a formal reestablishing of relations as we would normally expect to see between two countries that get along. This would be an exchange of what's called liaison officers. So it would be several from each side going over and establishing an office in each other's countries. It would be several people on the U.S. side. It would be led, for example, by a senior Foreign Service officer who would be fluent in Korean. So the establishment of a liaison office would be a very preliminary first step towards reestablishing relations, but this would be a big deal. This was last discussed back in 1994 when there was another big attempt at getting North Korea to denuclearize. And it went to the point that the U.S. actually signed a lease to rent space in the German mission in North Korea. This looked like it was going to happen, but the following year, North Korea completely pulled the plug on it. So this is something that is now being seriously discussed as an option to move something forward and could be announced at the summit in just a few days. Of course, a big question that remains is the U.S. requiring North Korea to show something or do something before this would happen? John?
But still, a potentially small but significant step forward. Thank you, Michelle. Now, government
this country have answered the government's calls to go to school as normal. This is a city here in Port-au-Prince, but right across the country, we're really torn apart by 9 days of very violent demonstrations calling for the resignation of both the president and the prime minister. The prime minister here has moved in the last 48 hours to try to draw the sting from that process, to try to say that they will move against corrupt officials. They will set up a government body to investigate and name those that they say are behind corruption, and that was in large part was behind these demonstrations. But the opposition is beginning to lose the momentum to some extent. Yesterday, they called for widespread demonstrations. That call wasn't answered. So there is, I think, at the moment, after the government deployed pretty much the whole police force, 16,000 people right across the country, and they've recently announced, John and Alison, a very weird element of the story that we're chasing down, which is that they claim to have arrested 7 foreign nationals, among them 5 Americans, who they allege, this is the government, maybe part of some kind of conspiracy. Very strange aspect to that story, but again, something of a distraction from the real politique here. Alison?
All right, Sam, thank you for those developments. Come back to us when you hear any more. Meanwhile, in just hours, President Trump will address the ongoing turmoil in Venezuela in a speech he gives in Miami. The U.S. has made it clear it recognizes Juan Guaido as interim president as pressure intensifies on embattled strongman Nicolas Maduro. More than 1 million people in Venezuela have already made their way to Colombia. On Saturday, a wave of U.S. aid arrived at the border, but Maduro resisted.